We're now going to look at question 5 on the sample paper. Explain the importance of three of the following in international relations. It's worth 15 marks. You've got to choose 3 out of the 4 and each part is worth 5 marks. It's a total of 15 marks. You're writing to convince, so your text purpose is persuasion. Persuade the examiner as to why each of these international events were important in terms of international relations. Remember, choose 3 out of the 4. If we were to look at the Tehran conference in 1943, we've got to gain 5 marks. At the Tehran conference, plans were made for the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. So far, that is just a simple statement, isn't it? So you need to consider its importance and make a judgment as to why it's important. Then you start to gain 5 marks. Remember, you're marked within a 3-tier band. So you've got to add explanation. So for example, this was important because it led to the division of Europe. The conference was important because it showed the Allies were divided up and how difficult the future would be. Britain, France and Russia agreed that Europe could be seen as 2 spheres of influence. This was really important. See, I'm making a judgment there in dividing Europe up for the next 50 years. But the powers could not agree on Germany's future. So I've explained the importance, sorry about the spelling mistake there, look, okay. I've explained the importance by adding in factual detail to gain 5 marks. To really convince the examiner I know what I'm talking about, I could add more detail, that the conference ran from the 28th of November to the 1st of December 1943. But again, I've got to outline why that's important, okay. It's important because the leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, outlined what would happen in post-war Europe during these key dates, but that they did not firm up any detail, and that further conferences such as Potsdam and Yalta would be needed to enable this to happen. I could mention that mistrust was clear between Stalin and Churchill. Roosevelt often sided with Stalin, e.g. the idea of an invasion of the Balkans to continue the fighting during the Second World War. For Stalin believed the motive was really to stop the spread of communism eastwards by Russia. I could state that it was also important because this conference, the Tehran conference, because a second front in Europe was to be started, and we know that Stalin was frustrated that this had not happened yet. He believed that Churchill and Roosevelt were looking for communism to damage themselves fatally, so as they could then reconstruct Europe with a weakened Russia. However, a second front was decided in June 1944 through France and Normandy, an invasion by Allied forces. Poland would be given land from Germany, is another reason why it was important, but would lose land to Russia, the USSR, and USSR would, with Germany defeated, declare war on Japan. Just some other additional information that came out of the Tehran conference. If you're looking at the formation of NATO in 1949, let's remember we've got to recall important knowledge. That's why your revision is absolutely critical, okay, to say why the formation of NATO was an important factor for developing international relations. If you don't revise, you simply can't do it. That's why I believe in mind mapping around such key events, so as you can visualise that in the examination. So let's explain the significance within an historical context. Okay, significance, importance. It was important because it was set up in response to the first military confrontation of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade, 1948 to 49, and hence raised the possibility of war in Europe. So I've backed up my factual detail with some explanation. It raised the possibility of war in Europe. This was an international alliance designed to keep the USA in and the USSR out within Europe and within the setup in Germany. Set up in April 1949. Show that you know the technical terms. North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, I haven't just used the abbreviation NATO, was also important in international relations because the key connective there, it showed unity between many Western European nations with the USA and was directly in opposition to the threat of the spread of communism and the USSR. Show some detail. Some of the members of this organisation were Britain, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Greece and West Germany. and pressed the examiner. They agreed to come to the defence of any NATO member under attack. Now here's where I'm going to gain my marks. This was therefore a significant message of unity and strength towards Soviet Union and the threat of communism. The formation of NATO marked a significant, important development in the Cold War. The Marshall Plan had created a powerful trading alliance to keep capitalism strong in Western Europe and West Germany, but NATO had gone a stage further. This was because it was a military alliance with the specific aims of defending the West against communism, and clearly determined East v West as two armed camps in direct opposition, setting the tone of events for the next 20 years. So that's me explaining why it's important, why it's significant, the impact it was having or going to have. Look at the use of language. Furthermore, it must have been highly important as the Soviet Union reacted and formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955, a military alliance of Eastern European countries that mirrored NATO. The countries included East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Russia, who already had the common form, but the Warsaw Pact, in direct opposition to NATO, was a stage further on than the common form, showing that NATO was too powerful to be ignored. So Europe, due to NATO, had evolved from being divided into two spheres of influence into two armed camps, heightening the Cold War. The Prague Spring, 1968. The Prague Spring was important because it was a direct challenge to lessen the harshness of communist way of life and create reform by the new Czech communist leader, Dubček. It aimed to develop and revitalise politics, economy and the social life of a repressed people. It was also important because it showed that some leaders were tiring of repressive communist rule from Central USSR, Soviet Union, and wanted change that enabled more cultural freedom for their people. So I've evidenced my point here by explaining why it was important. The aim really is to show synthesis and analysis. You're analysing why each event was important to explain this, but try and condense it into one paragraph. I'll show you a good example of this in a second. Furthermore, it showed that reforms such as relaxation of press censorship, legalisation of opposition groups, government toleration of political criticism, more freedom to regional governments and more power given to Czech parliaments were a challenge to Soviet beliefs and hence the sphere of Soviet influence. So what I'm saying here is these reforms did not sit well with the Soviet Union. They were a direct challenge to how communism had been run behind the imaginary Iron Curtain, the Eastern Bloc nations, for over 20 years. Market socialism was also important in that Dubček wanted to introduce capitalist elements into the Czech economy. This was highly significant as it was challenging 20 years of dominant Soviet influence over satellite Soviet states. So I'm making a judgment it was highly significant. Furthermore, the Prague Spring was significant because it shocked established Eastern Bloc communist leaders, including Brezhnev himself. This was because it was a direct challenge to the Soviet ideological, social, economic and political domination. It meant simply a shift towards capitalism that the Soviet Union could not afford if it were to keep its central position of power and influence. Hence, the Prague Spring was important because it highlighted that the Soviet Union would flex its military strength and invade Czechoslovakia, i.e. the Brezhnev Doctrine was born. So it shows that the Soviet Union were trying to keep control and maintain the status quo of its power of communism in Eastern Europe. This is a long paragraph here. Okay. The Prague Spring was also important in that it demonstrated that although Western nations would condemn Soviet action, they would not intervene. Remember, America were fighting a war in Vietnam at this time. Western communist parties in Italy and France were outraged and severed links with the Soviet Union. This showed that the Soviet Union were losing their authority and power due to their invasion of Czechoslovakia. This invasion led to discontentment in other Eastern Bloc nations after August 1968, such as Romania and Yugoslavia, who distanced themselves from the Soviet Union and set up closer links with China, the other great communist nation. So the Prague Spring was important because it showed that the communist world was becoming divided. While some nations feared the liberalism Czechoslovakia were trying to gain, others frowned upon the Soviet invasion. The Warsaw Pact was therefore weakened. Soviet Union and Brezhnev clearly feared that reforms in Czechoslovakia would be the start of the breakup of the Eastern Bloc and hence Soviet domination. The Prague Spring was stopped, reforms were reversed, but it showed that the Brezhnev doctrine would justify strong Soviet action to maintain the status quo. Here's an example of how you could condense all that into one paragraph to try and gain a level 3, 5 marks. Remember, they mark you in the middle level, and if you add, you develop your simple statement by adding explanation and analysis to explain why that point is important, then you'll gain higher marks. So you can pause that now and have a look at that and read it for yourself. Finally, if you choose to look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, you'll be picking, I believe, quite an easy one to detail and support with facts and opinion. Here's an example of a paragraph that may score you highly. The fall of the Berlin Wall was extremely important in events in this period because it was such an important event in ending the Cold War. Throughout 1989, the communist countries of Eastern Europe began rejecting communist government, and the fall of the Berlin Wall showed that it was happening in East Germany too. In elections in 1990, the communists were defeated in East Germany. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved in July 1991, and in December of that year, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War had come to an end, and the fall of the Berlin Wall symbolised the end of communist rule. I think that's a nice, succinct way. If you go back to my Prague Spring or the Tehran Conference, there's too much detail, but it's there for you to learn and revise if this type of question will come up, but whichever factors you've got to choose from. However, if you can synthesise and condense and make links between your points, you're going to score higher. Okay, and you've got a limited amount of space to write in. So, for example, throughout 1989, the communist countries of Eastern Europe began rejecting communist government, and then link this, and the fall of the Berlin Wall showed that this was happening in East Germany too. That was a central hotbed for the development of communism ever since 1948. So I'm making a link there, the same way I do in the next section. In elections in 1990, the communists were defeated in East Germany. Then go on to say the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in July 1991, and in December of that year the Soviet Union dissolved. So I make the link that the Cold War was coming to an end bit by bit, but that the Berlin Wall was the focus point, the symbolic end product of this ending of communist rule by the Soviet Union. Good luck.